Hello to everyone and welcome. My name is Marla Miller and I direct the Public History program at UMass Amherst, and you are at the session Public Intellectuals, Public History, and the History of the Profession. So just a little housekeeping. If you have questions during the session for the participants, please use the Q&A button below the screen for that. And if you want to just make comments and chat amongst yourselves, there's the feed loop sidebar for that. And if anything there needs to be transmitted to us, I believe there's a member of the NCPH board who will pitch in with that kind of thing. In a moment, I will invite each of our participants to introduce themselves to you and share their affiliations. But since they've all added their info and contact information into the feed loop bios, look there for longer biographical information about our presenters. But I wanted to begin by explaining that this session was really the brainchild of one of our presenters, panelist Michael Brown, who is the author of Hope and Scorn: Eggheads, Experts, and Elites in American Politics, which came out from the University of Chicago last year, 2020. Excellent year to have a book released, as many of us know. And his scholarship really looks at the history of debates about the role of intellectuals in public life and how that evolved over the course of the second half of the public history or 20th century. So we have all been in a conversation online about how we can use this thinking about the longer trajectory of public intellectuals to connect that to conversations that have long been afoot in the community of public history. I can say in the years that I've been in and around NCPH, there's been an ongoing thread of discussion about relationships between public intellectuals and public historians. And if you go to the public historian, you'll see a long thread in the pages of the journal, mostly in and around places where we're trying to define what public history is. And when I first entered the profession around 1999, there was a lot of concern about public intellectuals, and the public history community at that time, in my experience of it, was concerned about distinguishing public history from the kind of things that public intellectuals do, which I think was because at that time, the public history community was thinking a lot about audience engagement, sharing authority, and the co-creation of knowledge, and really wanted to distinguish that kind of work from what public intellectuals did and do. But I think in the past decade, that situation has changed a lot. And now with, I think particularly with the anti-intellectualism that we see afoot in American culture, we have started to think differently, and we're in a different conversation now about the role of public intellectuals. We've seen a lot of heroic work happening among public intellectuals, mostly on social media. And so this is a perfect opportunity to rethink this conversation and revisit the ways we talk about these categories of practice. So just to introduce our presenters and kind of situate them in this conversation, I'll say that my own connection to this material is through my role at UMass Amherst, where we've long had a graduate track that we kind of call Writing History Beyond the Academy. And a few years ago, we added to that courses in history communication, which is a term I learned from Jason Steinauer, who coined that term and got the field thinking about history communication, I think at NCPH in 2015, as I recall it. So we have Jason to thank for that. Panelist Pat Mooney-Melvin, and I want to say that she's from the graduate program at Loyola, which was recognized this year with an NCPH Founders Award. So hats off to Pat and her whole team there. Pat brings the longest view to this question, having been involved in NCPH since 1981. She's a past president of the organization and has been a leader in particular in conversations around curriculum and training. Ashley Bouknight Claybrooks brings her perspective as a community educator and museum consultant for various museums and historic sites in and around Nashville, Tennessee. And I've learned a ton from Ashley through the years through her dissertation, Black Museology. So maybe we'll get a chance to hear a little bit about that in our conversation. And lastly, Kirsten Delegard. Her Mapping Prejudice project is also the winner of an award this year, the NCPH Outstanding Project Award. So we'll take a moment to congratulate Kirsten for that. That project harnessed the power of the community to map racially restrictive deeds in Minneapolis. And in the last 5 years, Kirsten and her team have delivered more than 300 presentations on the history of structural racism and racist housing practices in the United States. So those are the projects that bring people to this conversation. And now I'm going to invite people to just go around and again, identify themselves so that people can make these connections. So Michael, do you want to start?
Marla, thank you for that introduction. You introduced me perfectly well. I'll just add to that, hello to everyone out there at virtual NCPH. It's always good to be with the public history community in any forum. So thank you for being in our panel today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And just remind us, Michael, where do you work? Where do people find you?
Assistant Professor of History, Rochester Institute of Technology.
Very good. And Ashley, how about you?
All righty. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Ashley Bouknight Claybrooks, and I am here in Nashville. I am currently the Senior Manager of Professional Development for the American Association for State and Local History. So it is a pleasure to be here with you all, and I look forward to an amazing conversation.
And Jason.
Yeah, Jason Steinhauer. I am easily findable on all sorts of websites, but most of the time these days you can actually find me on Clubhouse, which is a new social media platform that is audio only, in which I think has ramifications for this conversation. In fact, I'll be bringing that conversation to Clubhouse tonight. I am the host of something called the History Club on Clubhouse, which has about 68,000 people who follow it at the moment. In past lives, I've been a director of the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest. I was at the Library of Congress. I was a museum curator. I'm a certified archivist, and I've also done some stuff with the US Department of State. And I am also a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
Thank you. And Kirsten?
Hey, I am so glad to be here, and so sad that we're not doing this in person, but grateful that we could have this virtual space. So my name is Kirsten Delegard, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice Project. And we are located in the University of Minnesota libraries and in the Twin Cities. So we have begun this work in Minneapolis and have now, we're now expanding to other geographies. So I'm really interested in getting your perspective on directions that we might go in with this work.
That's great. And Pat?
Well, I'm Pat Mooney Melvin, and as Marla indicated, I'm like the really old timer here since I joined NCPH in 1981, kind of one of the first group of people to work. I started the program at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and most people in my cohort had worked outside of the university before they came into trying to put a public history program together. And so my experience was mostly at the Ohio Historical Society, although it now has a different name. But I was the curator of labor history while I was there. And I'm really glad that you all are going to be part of this conversation. So we're looking forward to your comments as well as the comments of all the rest of us.
Yeah, and again, let me remind people, the Q&A is at the bottom of your screen, and put your questions and thoughts there. Well, so to kick it off, I'm gonna just ask a general question and invite all you guys to respond. And that is this: what from your perspective is the difference between public historians, historians in public, and public intellectuals? And I'm gonna invite, since this whole session was Michael's idea, I'm gonna invite him to start the conversation.
Thanks, Marla. And I want to start by saying what an honor it is to be here with Marla, Ashley, Jason, Kirsten, and Pat. You are people whose many contributions I've admired, and it's a pleasure to be part of this session with you. So my observations flow not from long experience, but from a peculiar experience doing and teaching public history while researching and writing a book on public intellectuals. So keeping track of debates about the two, I saw how public historians and public intellectuals were often conflated. Some welcomed this identification, others pointed to important differences. And the public historian back in 2004 Burton Bledstein called the scholar as cultural spokesperson the inspired prototype of the public intellectual, including the public historian, in American civic life. In 2016, Carol Kamen wrote that public and local historians are also public intellectuals, though not always recognized as such by our audiences or even by ourselves. In 2018, then NCPH President Alexandra Lord called for an inclusive culture that embraced colleagues in the academy who may not define themselves as public historians, but who do work aimed at the public, including writing for the public. Lord noted that such writing is something that many public historians traditionally do not characterize as public history. She pointed to a tendency to see these kinds of historians as public intellectuals rather than publicly engaged historians. Launching an important H-Public discussion thread in 2007, Kathy Corbett and Dick Miller pointed to a recent New York Times obituary for Harvard history professor and Kennedy presidential advisor Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. that called him America's last great public historian. The announcement of our collective demise was premature, Corbett and Miller wrote, but a telling measure of public confusion about who we are and what we do. The Times writer probably meant, they guessed, something like public intellectual, but that hardly describes our work. That public intellectuals and public history have been conflated and that conflation debated may be a reflection of the fact that public history and public intellectual gained currency as terms within a few years of each other, public history taking pride of place by a few years. Their emergence was shaped by some of the same conditions, impulses, and ideas. We know that there were public historians and public intellectuals in the United States long before the advent of those labels in the late 1970s and mid 1980s. So what that period saw was the emergence of these terms as focal points for debates about the role of academically trained professionals in public life. Across a range of disciplines and more broadly in American culture, the role of experts and intellectuals was up for debate by the late 70s. The freedom struggles and social movements of the 60s and 70s had spotlighted and challenged the racist, sexist, classist, and frequently intersecting modes of exclusion that barred access to professionally credentialed expertise. Post-colonial, feminist, and other liberationist critiques further noted that experts and intellectuals had sometimes operated not in the mode of objective detachment, which was supposed to be the distinguishing feature of their role, but in the service of, if not hegemony, at least the status quo. Critics on the right were challenging the social and political role of intellectuals as well. The neoconservative writer Irving Kristol said it was part of his mission to explain to the American people why they are right and to the intellectuals why they are wrong. And we know that this was a time of postmodernism, of challenging the foundations of knowledge. As philosopher Michel Foucault claimed, each society has a regime of truth, not an absolute rock bottom truth. These debates raised questions, really intensified questions about whether intellectuals, historians prime among them, functioned to challenge the status quo, shore up the status quo, or somehow float above the fray. Concepts like objectivity, detachment, and commitment were at the center of discussion. So were the material bases of intellectual life, like academic employment. If you read the first issues of the Public Historian, you'll see that these topics were throughout. G. Wesley Johnson in 1978 said that it was a point when modern society was sending signals to the history profession asking for help, but academic history had not responded. Years later, just a few years later, Russell Jacoby said that what was being observed by public historians applied to the whole terrain of American intellectual life. He argued that intellectuals no longer needed or wanted a larger public. His book, The Last Intellectuals, in 1987, is often credited as coining the term public intellectual. He said that campuses were now intellectuals' homes and colleagues their audience. He was less concerned with what he called the eclipse of the public than what he called the eclipse of public intellectuals. Sounded a lot like G. Wesley Johnson from 1978. While the terms public history and public intellectual emerged in the same years and addressed similar debates, they proceeded in different directions. The model of the public intellectual that Jacoby described in the 80s is in some ways still the model that describes someone like Heather Cox Richardson with her very well-regarded Substack newsletter today. The model of the public historian, by comparison, has undergone significant renovation driven by robust theoretical conversations, diverse practical experience, and an expanding genealogy. While authorship and thus authority have been central for public intellectuals, public historians have rethought the nature of authority itself. The product of public intellectualism largely remains a written text. In public history, the processes of meaning making and shared authority have moved to the center of the field.
Well, Pat, that's a narrative that you experienced over the course of your career. Do you want to share where you intersect with that trajectory?
Certainly. One of the things that when I entered the field of history in the 1970s, one of the things that always struck me as bizarre about the historical profession was the fact that if you were an economist or if you were a sociologist or a political scientist, you could move in and out of the academy and nobody thought that that was weird. But to suggest that a historian might do that was seen as bizarre and out of the ordinary, or that you would not even really be recognized if you came back. Now, partly, I suppose it was a combination of the job market at the time I was finishing up, which was the late 70s. But it also was a notion that I had that I needed to get experience in both worlds because I wanted to have that option that I could move, that somehow I wasn't captured by any particular one system. And it was at that point, I remember working at the Ohio Historical Society when the first issue of the Public Historian came out. And that discussion that Bob Kelly in particular, along with Wes Johnson, had about the nature of what historians could do and where historians needed to be found and what voice they might have was incredibly liberating at the time. Now, over time, I think in some kind of odd ways, the world of kind of public history was wide in their vision at that point. It narrows, where then oftentimes gets conflated, whether rightly or wrongly, with museum work and archival work and preservation work, to some extent with community work. Some of these early notions of public history about the role as policymakers and being engaged in business and all these kind of other areas has kind of entered back in the most unlikely way through the AHA's career diversity activities, where all of a sudden that kind of wider view has come out. But through that, I think you really do see, at some point we'll talk a bit more about training, but the biggest change in that, and thinking in terms of this outward facing look, I think that we want and feel that history should have, is that in these very early years, when we're trying to figure out how in the world to teach public history, it was so venue driven in a sense, like I'm going to teach a course that dealt with museums, or that you weren't really thinking of, and you were talking about technique. And one of the kind of liberating aspects of the growth, I think, of public history, which will feed, has the possibility of feeding into this larger debate about public intellectuals and so forth, or historians as public intellectuals, is that, as has been suggested, we think in terms of audience in a very different way. And writing and speaking in a very public facing way is now part and parcel, at least of the training that I've been involved in. And that takes reorientation for students, but it also takes some reorientation for our colleagues who don't often see themselves as public facing. The notion that we bring our historical expertise and share it with the world has been under, well, not only has it taken a while for people to accept that should be the case. It's so much easier to just assume that you have history knowledge and talk about history and have none. Nothing really to back it up, but certainly over the last 4 years, that type of knowledge has been under attack. And so I think this is kind of timely to think about the ways in which our responsibilities rest in keeping history, or in injecting history in many cases, as part of the player in the conversation about issues of importance in current life, as well as getting us to think both, if we conflate all of those terms to a hinge and think about their connections between past and present, and how we can, instead of shutting that door, open that door, we have a lot of possibilities.
I feel like these questions of categories and the degree to which they're useful, the public historians, and public intellectuals, has shaped the trajectories of Ashley, Jason, and Kirsten's careers. So I'll be eager to hear what you guys have to say. Ashley, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. So what's really interesting about this conversation is how I actually got into the field. So I started as a preservationist. So I'm, learning about how to repoint bricks, and and it evolved into working into museums. So I feel like I've come into this field from a very different angle from a number of my colleagues. And so I always bring a different perspective to this conversation, because I'm always looking at this as, a very public facing, a very hands-on type of work, when some of my colleagues are coming at it from a different angle. And so I'm looking at all of these titles as sort of a spectrum, and it all represents a way to gather and disseminate the information. And each one of these titles, they really need each other. And I think over the years, people are starting to understand the importance of those connections. And even as I started becoming more comfortable in the academic side of what I've been doing, I've been learning that public intellectuals for years have been merging these titles. It isn't something new. Looking at my own research in my dissertation, Black museology, we're looking at Black intellectuals who have always been what we now consider public historians. They've always been the face of academia as well as community organizing. There wasn't a separate sphere. It was always one sphere. And these academic institutions were also community institutions. And so we're in a space where we need to separate them, and we need to have distinct areas of focus when that's not traditionally what we've been doing. And I think the more that people become comfortable with flowing along that spectrum and learning to reach out to other areas of that spectrum, the work will be a lot richer. We'll be able to have more people comfortable having that forward-facing attitude towards history and public history. It'll just make for richer content if we just go back to some of that earlier ways of doing the material where we all just work together despite the titles that we may have along those areas.
I'm seeing a lot of nodding from Kirsten. Did you want to?
Yeah, I'm just enjoying everything that all the insights that I'm hearing here. This is wonderful. Thank you. So it's interesting. I feel as you all are talking again, like I have to bring this back to myself. So in terms of my own personal trajectory and thinking about this, and I feel like I've tried on each one of these hats at different times. So I was drawn from being, a traditionally trained academic historian, drawn into a desire to reach a broader audience and aspired to be a historian in public. And that's what really shifted me, I think, from traditional modes of academic communication into seeking new ways to reach audiences. And in that process, I aspired to be a public historian. Like I aspired to actually be in dialogue and to be co-collaborative, but I didn't know how to do it, right? And it took a long time to figure out how some ways to do, and I'm not saying that I have it all figured out by any stretch of the imagination. It's always, right? Always a work in progress. But I think there's some people who think that, and present company accepted, of course, who think that just by speaking to a broader audience, they are public historians. But we all know, that's not the case, that they're very different methodologies. And as we're talking to people about mapping prejudice and the way we do our work, I'm continually explaining this to academics around the country who are like, oh, this is so cool. You've reached so many people. And they sort of lay out for me and their vision of a project they want to do that's very top down, and that does not involve community engagement really. And so the last piece of this is that in the process of becoming a public historian and doing all these, being willing and being invited out to every kind of group you can imagine, from the Zamia theater troupe for the unhoused in Minneapolis to the Federal Reserve and everything. And I've spoken to every Rotary Club in Minnesota. I feel like people then want me to become a public intellectual. Like they want to call me and have me pronounce on all kinds of things. And I'm like, and that's where I feel profoundly uncomfortable. But it's not because I don't have opinions, and it's not because I don't think that history is valuable. But again, like I feel like where my heart is and where I feel like we need to be is in that public history space, right? Where we're constantly making meaning together with people. I mean, people have just taught me, the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who we've come into contact with. It really has not been a didactic experience. Like people have taught me way more, I feel like, than we have so-called delivered to them. But people, and I feel like to some degree, yes, I want to be a public intellectual. I want to provide the insights of what we do to as many people as possible. I'm shocked when I go into a lot of groups, like bankers and realtors are groups that I talk to a lot, and none of them have learned any history. That's what they say, or, and we can talk about why that is, right? But anyway, where was I going with this, with the public intellectual? But they want me to pronounce on things, and I feel like the more I do that, the more I risk losing people's trust in a way. I feel like we're in this huge trust deficit as a society, and the way that we can continue, I guess, to shore up trust in history, trust in these processes, trust in the insights that we can bring to the table is by continually involving people in the meaning making of history. So with that, I will hand it off to my very wise.
So we're starting to see, some tensions emerge between, like ways that these categories are valued and ways that they are, holding us back. And I wonder, Jason, how does this intersect with the kind of work you've been trying to do in the field of history communication and beyond that?
Good question. I mean, I feel like these labels are always elusive, right? As soon as you try to like adhere them onto a specific subset of people, you find people who don't fit into them or who slide across different labels and hold different hats depending on what stage they are in their career or what they may be doing at a particular time. I mean, am I a public intellectual? Am I a public historian? Am I a historian who does stuff in public? Am I a history communicator? I'm probably all of the above at certain points and none of the above at certain points. Part of me with these things also tries to like think about what the inverse is. So like, what's a private intellectual? Like, is that just somebody who sits in their bedroom and reads books, but then doesn't talk about it? So like on some level, the word is meaningless, right? And it reminds me a little bit of what Don Ritchie, the former historian of the Senate, always used to say about presidential historians, right? So Don would always tell the story about how presidential historians was a media creation. It was invented by PBS. It was a way of giving authority to certain people to talk about the presidency. And the term public intellectual sort of has that same odor about it, right? It's sort of, as Kristen said, it gives people a legitimacy to talk about whatever the issue of the day is, even if they don't have the necessary expertise to make that comment. And that could be quite a lucrative expertise, right? That could be quite a lucrative endeavor. And we've seen that public intellectuals don't have to be historians. They can be journalists, they can be pundits, they can be all kinds of people off the street who use networks and other levers of power to then go make claims about things and take lots of money for it. And sometimes those claims are incredibly inaccurate and incorrect. So I think the point that was made about methodology before is critical, right? The real distinctions here is how we go about the work, right? And that's what journalists are always saying that differentiates journalists from fake news and other bloggers and things like that, right? Like when you're a journalist, you adhere to a methodology. You gather sources, you fact check those sources, you go through an editing process, and at the other end comes out something that we call journalism. Well, public historians do the same thing. We have a methodology. That methodology is rooted in lots of practice and praxis. It's been litigated in our private journals and online. And when we do public history, we go through a process, we follow that guideline. At the end, something comes out that we call public history. And that's how you know someone's a public historian and how they're not. Now, the challenge is that methodology is largely invisible to the general public, right? So they don't really know all that stuff. So one of the things that I've talked about with history communication and has been written about on NCPH's blog is, pulling back that curtain and really being more transparent about that methodology. And I think the future of the internet actually provides a lot of opportunities for that. And I'm going to talk about that in my book that's coming out later this year. And then the other thing is around with history communication, the whole point of history communication was to put some guidelines and best practices around how we communicate on the web, because at the time that we came up with it in 2015 and 2016, that didn't really exist in public history training. Now it's started to exist since then, and I hope that history communication has been part of that. But the idea is to create standards and best practices around how public historians and other historians use social media in their work. And if we do that, then we can actually say we have a methodology that has been litigated and has been examined and that we all believe in. So that's some of the ideas that are in my head. The last thing I'll point out, as I said in our group chat, is that I think one of the distinctions among all these categories is money, which is unfortunate, but it's a reality, right? Public historians get paid far less than academic historians who speak in public. Heather Cox Richardson was mentioned before. She's a tenured professor. She also has a Substack where she rakes in $1 million. That's to her credit, but public historians aren't making that types of money. And then public intellectuals who are servicing Congress or think tanks, they make even more money. So one of the questions too is what type of work do we value and who gets compensated for that work? And how do we make the argument that public historians are as valuable to the ecosystem as these other categories?
Your use of the phrase "pulling back the curtain" makes me think too of Bob Wyanus' president. Was it his presidential address? But I think that's on History at Work. You know, that was so.
Yeah, that's where I got it from. Footnoted. Thank you.
Yeah. I think, you know, the public remains, despite so much labor on this front, you know, people don't quite understand what it is that historians do and what historical expertise looks like. And I feel like that's so much of this work that's been happening on social media is trying to reveal, you know, what the role of evidence is. And so there's been some powerful work happening there. But this thread makes me think about the ecosystems in which all of these careers unfold and this work unfolds: journalism and the media, the nonprofit world, the museum world, all of these economic ecosystems. And so I wonder if we should think a little bit about how the public enters those and how these categories do or do not resonate for the audiences that encounter this content in different spaces. So I don't know, Michael, can we throw it back to you on that?
Thank you to everybody for those comments. That was wonderfully informative. Public history has sometimes been characterized as having this sort of middle position with respect to publics on the one hand and the academy on the other, a middle position between a body of historical scholarship that is said to be inaccessible and popular history or public awareness of history that is said to be inaccurate. And public historians have the hardest job in the world. And as Jason pointed out, they should be compensated accordingly because they are said to face this double challenge of maintaining the rigor and the methodology that is part of the training of being a historian in any context that one is a trained historian, maintaining that rigor while achieving popular, not just accessibility, but appeal. My unfortunate students are a captive audience. The audiences beyond those lecture halls have other options. And so if you think about the sort of audience-oriented approach to this, it's rife with tensions among popular history, public history, academic history, with public history really sort of being in the rumble seat of all those tensions. And I think the rumbling that we have experienced as public historians has deepened our insights, really broadened our sense of practice, renovated our sense of audience, and contributed to the entire reframing of historical authority that has really been sort of housed in public history conversation, excuse me, over a number of decades now. And so where that leads us, I think, is towards a process orientation that is distinctive in public history and away from this audience orientation. And I think there's actually more room for alignment among a number of different kinds of history practice in a process orientation. So instead of an academic history that speaks to a misinformed public, a popular history that by virtue of its popularity speaks for the kind of history that mass publics might prefer, a process orientation emphasizes speaking with each other about the past in a conversation that is inclusive and iterative, that's ongoing, that never closes, never ends. I think public historians participate in that conversation insofar as public historians are members of communities and citizens of polities. And so, as Kirsten said, she has opinions. She could pronounce them in the role of a public intellectual, but she's kind of modulating and always being reflexive about her own position in that space of conversation. And that's, I think, a hallmark of public history, is that we don't just participate in conversations, we also nourish, sustain, and critically reflect upon conversational spaces. And to Jason's point about money, those who move around in spaces seem to pull down more reward than those who actually build, sustain, and maintain spaces. And that does seem to be backwards, because we need the people who build, maintain, and sustain the spaces for anyone to act in those spaces, to speak in those spaces, to have a profile in those spaces.
Kirsten or Jason, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a hot topic on my project recently, because we are in such, we are getting so many requests for speaking engagements, and it would be easy for us, it wouldn't be easy, we actually don't have the resources, but it would be easier for us to just like start being sort of public intellectuals, you know, just speaking. But to your point, but the really truly exhausting and resource demanding work is exactly what Michael was saying, the nourishing the spaces. That's the stuff that leaves us all just exhausted. I mean, exhausted and also energized, right? That's the meaning, that's the hard work. And yeah, and there is really no support for that. And no, and you know, I don't want to jump ahead to some of the other questions that we had sort of outlined here, but there's also no reward system in any framework, any institution that I know of that rewards that. You know, there's no rubric by which, I mean, I guess it's called program evaluation, right? Like, how well did you nurture spaces for a diverse range of people to come together and really have meaningful conversations? How do you measure that? I haven't seen, I mean, please, maybe this will be my insight. Someone will say, I have the perfect way to measure that and reward it. If you do, please let me know, because I need it tomorrow. Because that's what we should all be, I mean, that's what I mean, I just feel so strongly that that's what we all should be focusing on, so.
Well, I would like to jump in. As part of this, I was struck when Kirsten was talking about the way that the heavy work when you are doing a project where you want to really draw the community in. And I remember, and in part it's because Arkansas is a small state. I mean, it's physically large in the sense that it's about the size of Ohio, but when I was there, it had 1 million people in the entire state, which is nothing. And when we did this project on women's history, the group of us who were doing it became sought after by all sorts of groups. And what was exciting about that process, a little unnerving in some cases, because I had the opportunity and the pleasure, although I was a little unnerved about how to talk to battered women about the history of women, showing slides from the 19th century, late 19th and early 20th century, which is where where the work I was doing was centered. But the energy that you got from groups who felt that their voices were being heard and that you were not judging them, but instead were engaged in a journey, that process, you know, and harnessing that to move it into how we teach public history, you know, varies in different places, and we'll probably touch on that a little bit later. But that part of the process, I think, is really what makes public historians this central, or makes what we do in terms of process, as both in different ways, both Jason and Michael have talked about. That process is what allows us really to make these connections. And Ashley spoke to it when she spoke to the earlier period where we worked, you know, where it was more organic than the ways in which it's become. But that piece of the process is so central if we are, as historians, public intellectuals, whatever our sense of ourselves are. It's that part of the process that I think is really critical if we are to move the enterprise forward. Knowing how to engage, and obviously those ways of engagement. I mean, when I was talking with my women, I had my little slide projector, and now, you know, that would not be would be the case. And Jason certainly is much more attuned to the various ways than I could describe of how to communicate as mostly a viewer of social media rather than an engager in social media myself. But it's those spaces that allow us to think, I think, creatively about the past and our responsibility to the past, as well as to the present population and the future.
I'll add to this. I know that when I first began in this field, I struggled with how I saw myself interacting with the public, but also interacting with the material. And because I came into the field as a preservationist versus a quote unquote traditional historian, I always had a loyalty to the content, to the material first, and then focused on how I was perceived by the public. But the more you got into it, the more you realized you had to be so intentional with how you spoke about the content, how you really put the material out there. And now I will always say that, you know, being a public facing historian is actually the most important part, because there are so many people who, like you were saying, Kirsten, they don't have that interaction with history at all. And so sometimes you're the only face they will ever see. And so I'm always concerned about, you know, what speaking engagements I take, what don't I take. You know, there is a strong concern about, you know, people accepting, requiring payment for things and all these things you have to think about. But I'm always in my head reminding myself, what is the bigger outcome? What is the most necessary thing that I can get out of this material and out of presenting it? And it's just, if I can get the material out there to as many people as possible, that's what's most important. Because I know that I now wear many hats. I'm an educator. I am a collections manager. I'm all these things, and it's a huge responsibility. And I don't think we think about that when we enter this field, about all the hats that we're gonna wear. We just get in there with this excitement of, I want to do this work, I want to research this material, not realizing you're taking on 50 different jobs and the toll that it takes on you as an individual. That's something I don't think we think about, and the long-term effects of that. I'm still new to this field. I still consider myself new to this field, but sometimes I already feel tired. I already feel tired, and I'm not sure if I'm doing my best, if I am approaching the material that's helping as many people as possible. There's always this sense of imposter syndrome. And so you're always fighting with yourself, with how you're representing yourself. If you're representing an institution, how that's coming across. There's just this constant mind debate that goes on. And I'm not sure if there's ever an answer for that. I think everyone approaches it differently. But I think that as I move forward in the field, I'm just focused on helping folks understand the history, focusing on co-creation. How do I make the content sustainable? And that's, if I can do that as best as possible at the end of the day, I figured I've done my job.
I really want to second that. I love what you're saying about the sort of emotional costs for practitioners of that, when you have to be alert at all times about which of those many identities you're deploying, and it's probably not even one at a time. So there's that you know, that emotional well, you know, gets dry when you're trying to do that kind of work. And also the need to have the skill to speak in all of those voices. And then to Kirsten's point, the weight of it, like kind of knowing that the work you're doing has consequences, and, you know, having those bankers and lawyers, and like, this is your shot to get them to not only understand the content that you're trying to offer them, but the importance of historical perspective in general.
Marla, can I chime in a little bit?
Please.
So obviously I agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said so far. But I think we also should acknowledge that we have blind spots, right? And so we should recognize, number one, that you don't have to be a historian to be a public intellectual, right? We all believe with absolute, like 100% sincerity that history is critical to everything, but not everybody believes that. And, that's part of the challenge, right? Is trying to convince people. But the reality is, as was said earlier, if you're an economist, if you're a political scientist, if you are an anthropologist, if you are a chemist, right, you can still be a public intellectual and you have no obligation to invoke history when you do so. So I think what Kristen does with these interdisciplinary conversations where she goes into other sectors of society, I think that type of work is like so critical, because it gets people who aren't thinking about history at all to at least bring it into their thought process, right? And that's what we try to do with the History Club on Clubhouse, because we're talking to people from all around the world, from all different backgrounds. But the reality is, like, there's no obligation, right? Like, the banker is not obligated to care about history. It's our job to try to make them care about history, right? And so I think sometimes we become a little bit like, we become self-reflexive naturally because it's so passionate. We're so passionate about it and it's so important to us. But then we have to have that like astral projection where we look outside ourselves and realize that, like, it's not going to be, other publics are not going to be as passionate about it as we are about it. And so how much of that is our responsibility? Like, how much are we supposed to like make everybody passionate about it? How much are we supposed to go to every real estate meeting, every banker meeting, every economist, every think tank in Washington, and be that voice? Like, none of us has the time or the bandwidth for that, and no one's going to pay us to do that, right? So that's why NCPH is so critical. It's why ASLH is so critical. It's why AHA is so critical. It's why SHFG is so critical. Like, and that's the ecosystem that needs to have them funding and the support to do that type of work, because we as individuals can't take that on.
Well, maybe at this point we can shift to another thread, because we want to have plenty of time to hear from our audience members and see what questions they bring to the conversation. And the sort of specter of graduate training has risen a couple times in this conversation, especially Ashley, when you were talking about, that kind of work, how do we learn? I was thinking about, that we need to learn to speak in all those registers, but that is not necessarily what your typical graduate program is focused on. So I wonder if we could, just share some thoughts about what we think is happening in graduate training, what might happen, what should happen. Any thoughts on your experiences in that area?
I will definitely share with that. I don't think that I was fully prepared for for everything that I was going to encounter. I was actually discouraged from going into public history as a focus because it wasn't considered real history, that I wasn't getting the material that I needed to really stand up against quote unquote real historians. And I definitely don't think that's true, especially as a student of Dr. Rebecca Connard. That's not true. You're gonna get it all. And so I always say I could stand up against anyone in the field with the material that I researched and still be able to have the public face of public history. And I think that once you're going into public history, if in the graduate programs, if there was more conversation about what your responsibility is going to be, but also making sure that people understand the role that academic life plays into that, because they're taught in two separate spheres. And there needs to be more of, you need the historiography, you need all of that content, but you also need to know how to go into community workshops and work with folks. Like, there needs to be both. And what usually happens is you get all the academic information first, and then at the end, you may get a little sprinkling on of what public work looks like. Or if you're in public history programs and you get more of the public history and not enough of the academic stuff. There needs to be all of that going on simultaneously, because what happens is there are so many public historians who, as Jason say, don't have that background knowledge, and they're just the public face of lots of content, and they don't have the information to back it up. I've seen that a lot more than I would like to see it. And so there needs to be more harmony in those discussions, more harmony in that coursework, and not having one phase start with one and the second phase following it up. They need to be happening at the same time.
Well, Marla, you know what I'm going to say, so I'll just say it. I think every graduate program needs to have a history communication course, at least one. And that's what Marla and I have been working on for the past 5 years. And she actually did it at UMass, but we have a long way to go to get that. But the reality is we have to prepare students for communicating in this incredibly diverse and complex media and cyberspatial landscape. And there's been some improvement in that respect over the past 5 years, but what we've done with history communication is actually codify it into a course, several courses, in fact. And we have resources on our website. We have a syllabus on our website. There are courses that have been taught at UMass, at Wayne State, derivatives or inspirations taught at Purdue. Also, there's a history on the web class at Rochester that Jonathan Smucker teaches. So we need more courses like that. And we've been working hard for the past 5 years to build them, and they're ready. You can plug and play. You can insert your own ideas, your own readings, your own teachings, your own faculty into them. But there's no reason that any student leaving a public history program at this point should not have done some work on understanding how Twitter works, understanding how YouTube works, how to put together a good Twitter thread, how to make YouTube videos, how to design a podcast, how to sustain a podcast. All that stuff should be baked into the training, in my humble opinion. And that's what some of us have been fighting for the past 5 years.
I'd like to second that. One of the things that I've seen over the course of my trajectory is, I think, the recognition say after 2000, that there had to be something in terms of media. That's typically how it was talked about. But when I think of our own program, that's now brought in multiple ways. Partly it has to do with who's teaching the course. So there's some of that, but every student now, for the most part, in our both traditional and public history sides of our program, take what they call public history media, but it's really digital. It's a digital media class. And so they do many of the things that Jason has talked about. And what we see happening is that it then bleeds into the other classes that they take, both in terms of some of their traditional classes slowly. Some of our colleagues are willing to introduce other modes of communicating the knowledge that they have. So we've taken baby steps in a sense. I've had colleagues who are now willing to have blog projects as part of what they're doing, and then to have those blogs actually on a site. Again, thinking in terms of how you're always communicating with a public, in addition to the fact that I think one of the things that I've seen the change in most over my time is when these public history programs started, we were so concerned with providing data and technique, and there was that focus. And then there was maybe one course that put you out in the community and worked in a collaborative way. At least that's certainly how it was set up at Little Rock when I was there. By the time I got to Chicago, they didn't have that course. And it was probably one of the best things, I think, because it was integrated into every course, so that every public history course, I can't be that broad to say that my colleagues would integrate it into their course even today, but the recognition that you had to always have some type of a public engagement or and even if it was unsatisfactory, engagement with the public in some way, shape, or form as part of the applied side of every course. It doesn't completely eliminate, and I know that in part of what Ashley, since I've worked long with Rebecca, there's always that kind of creative tension in those classes between theory and application. But I think that process, at least that I saw, that in that early movement away from where it was really just in the single course, where in almost every public history class, you're working with an outside group, you're working in some way, shape, or form to get some of that experience. Now, getting some of our colleagues who really feel more uncomfortable with that, or they say that they can do it, but they're certainly not going to include it in the classroom, that remains an issue. The inability to think about the various ways that one can present well thought out and structured and researched history, but in multiple venues. Whether it's a graphic novel, whether it's something that has a digital side to it, getting that understanding that any of that is based on what we do as historians in terms of process, interpretation, research, and so forth. But I think it's not as grim as it was in the 90s. And certainly the work that Jason and others have done to really insist that we take communication much more seriously has been important.
Michael, I know you've brought a historical lens to this and looked at how the field has evolved over time.
Yes, so that's one of two ways that I want to second some of Ashley's comments from earlier in the session. One, Ashley, is your comment about being tired, and I'm on my fourth can of cold brew since lunch. So I certainly understand what that feels like. The second is you have contributed to, and you also raised the issue of earlier, the genealogy of public history and the really kind of expansive root system that public historians can now draw on to ask ourselves, who are our predecessors? Who are our forebears? What are the models that we can draw strength from? And I think that's a really notable sign of the strength of the historiography that's come out in the last 20 years. So in terms of graduate training, the historiography course is always a part of it. And 30 years ago, histories of the profession were very focused on what I would call the sort of cognitive, philosophical foundations of knowledge, a real cognitivist approach to what the historian's task was. Peter Novick's That Noble Dream, the objectivity question in the historical profession, was literally and figuratively a big book. There was a 1991 roundtable in TPH about that. But in that roundtable, David Glassberg had already said, public historians are going to approach the history of history differently because communicating with non-historians every day, we public historians have a different experience of historical work. And so to me, the historiography of the last 20 years has been much more interested in what I would call history in a democracy than the sort of cognitivist approach to the epistemology of historical knowledge. So some of what we see, and I think there are folks in our session who have contributed their work to this body of historiography. The cognitivist approach sees kind of distance and detachment as constitutive of the historian. And some of the newer historiography has emphasized embeddedness in communities, accountability to those communities, service to those communities, and then locations on the periphery, non-elite locations, as turning out to be the distance and the detachment from the elite locations to have new, powerful, critical insights. And I think it's to combat imposter syndrome. When you read the historiography, can you locate yourself in it? And I hope that the answer with a lot of the more recent historiography is that you can. I'm thinking of so many books, but Alison Landsberg, 2015 book, Engaging the Past, makes this case for what she calls the experiential or affective mode in conjunction with more explicitly cognitive modes in the acquisition of historical knowledge. Richard Rabinowitz focused on public history as what he called an alternative method of intellectual discovery, emphasizing the spatial, emphasizing the embodied, the affective, as well as the traditional kind of cognitive model. And so this historiography suddenly opens up this kind of rich horizon for not what is the nature philosophically of historical knowledge, but what is the broad panorama of historical consciousness in a democracy. And suddenly, public history is at the center of I think the major concern that has come to us these last 4 years. Indeed, what is the nature of historical consciousness in a democratic society? How robust is it? Where does it live? Who sustains it? Who challenges it? And so forth. So I think that I saw there was a question from a graduate student. Historiography can feel like a slog, but there's such a rich recent crop of work out there that I think allows public historians to really lean back into this expanded root system of public history that is central to concerns beyond the field of public history.
Yeah, we should shift to Jamie's question in the Q&A, but Kirsten, before we move on to that, do you want to weigh in on the question? Oh, you're muted.
Yep, no, okay. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that I would love to say, and I feel I'm getting so nourished by hearing what everyone is saying, because everything that you all are saying just resonates so deeply with me right now. But Michael, to your point of this, we've seen in the last 4 years, I guess maybe this is outside of the scope of this discussion, but I feel like I have never been in a moment where people, where history has not been more central than the current day. And I don't think it's just because we're historians working, public historians, but I feel like I've never seen such a proliferation of podcasts, of articles in the popular press, of books, of conversations. I mean, I think the 1619 Project is just one example of this. So I mean, I feel like this is our moment as historians, and this is our moment to rethink what it means, and to really, I mean, I know that's what we all have been doing for our whole career. So I'm not trying to, slight that or ignore that in any way. But yeah, it just this feels like a profoundly important moment to be having this discussion, I guess, about what it is that we're doing. And maybe every moment feels like that. So.
A quick shameless plug that galaxy and universe of history content online is what my book is about coming up. So I'll be interested to hear what you think, Kristen, after you read the book.
I want to throw out one quick thought and then segue, but I'm a social historian by training and women's historian, but in conference sessions I've been at, I feel like there's another interesting thing happening to the side of all this, where intellectual historians are becoming ever more encompassing about what constitutes intellectual history. And so as we're talking about like the public having their own intellectual history, I feel like that's another promising thread that these two areas can come closer together. But to segue to this very good question about advice to graduate students, I can't resist throwing out that I have long had this fantasy that there'll be a handbook to choose your graduate program that'll be just like the old mobile camping guides, right? So across the top is the little tent and the, if there's camping and, whatever, a dock if there's boating, it's all the things. And then down the list is how many things does your campground offer? So in my guide, like column 1 is, we'll teach you how to write an article. Well, everyone's checking that box. And the next column is going to be like, you might learn to write a book. Well, most of them are going to check that box. And then the other columns are just these things. Like, do you know how to run a podcast? Do you know how to use Twitter effectively? Do you know how to write an exhibition? And like, we'll see how many graduate programs can like run the page and really teach people all the things they have to know. So I'm just putting that out there so that one of you in the audience can make that happen for us. But to turn to Jamie's question, our conversation has mostly been advice that could be taken up by faculty and administrators that run graduate programs. What do you do if you're a student who's on the other side of that conversation? How can they do the kind of training or push for it that we think should be out there?
I don't know. I mean, I was heartened to hear your descriptions of graduate classes that all of you have developed that serves all these training needs, because I sure did not get that in graduate school. Yes, I went to graduate school in the Stone Age, so Marla and I were in graduate school at the same time. but yeah, it's so I'm not saying, but I have honestly not seen a lot of. In the institutions I've been in, I have not seen a lot of advancement on that, and some of it has to do with the faculty who so the people who rise through the ranks in R1 schools, they're rewarded for just one or two things, right? They're rewarded for their ability to write books and write journal articles, and we've all been talking about how hard and time consuming this other kind of work is, and people, it's very hard to get rewarded. So I would say you have to be fearless about your own vision and be willing to forge your own path, and also really be sort of skeptical about the very strong cultural acculturation process that happens in academia, in terms of seeking out other kinds of mentors and experiences. I mean, that's what I wish I had done when I was in graduate school, is be fearless about following my own heart to some degree, instead of following what people say. Here's the path A, B, and C that you have to follow to get to this mythical job that doesn't exist actually anymore. So,
can I offer some controversial advice?
You're always stirring the drink, Jason.
I know, it's like, I just totally live up to my stereotype. It's great. Okay, so over the course of my career, I have met a number of graduate students who felt very intimidated by their professors and wanted different things from their programs that they were afraid to ask their professors for and make vocal to their faculty about. And as a result, you end up paying a lot of money to go to a master's program, and you don't come out the other side with what you had hoped you would come out with. And so my advice to graduate students would be, whether it's individually or collectively, don't be intimidated by your faculty and speak up. If there are things that you're not getting from your program that you think you need to be successful, you should let your department know. And I know that's really hard, because those are the people giving you the grades, and they're the people that you look up to, rightly so, because they're all brilliant. But the training matters, especially when it's at the master's level and you're paying for it. And master's degrees aren't cheap unless you're getting a scholarship or you're having some sort of, teaching arrangement or other sort of position on campus where you're offsetting tuition. So, even if it's not going to affect you directly, it'll affect the people who come after you. If you can, find the courage and unify together and speak up to the department and let them know that you think there needs to be more of X and less of Y, or you like Y, but you also want to see, in addition, like some other component that would supplement Y with Z. And I think graduate students just too often don't do that because they're intimidated and they don't feel like it's their place. And I would like to tell people that you should feel empowered to do that. And if you need help, you can reach out to me and we can talk about it.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, that the voice of bringing in the voice of the graduate student, and departments do this in different ways. But I think look to two groups. One is to find a faculty member that you know is going to be sympathetic, because most departments will have at least one who is going to be sympathetic to that view, and enlist their engagement in that process, whether it's having them put together a survey that everybody participates in to see what's needed, so that there's, you know, kind of the anonymity of the survey instrument, which will allow for some ideas to come up, but also to then have a strong history graduate student organization that begins to be vocal based on some data, always, you know, make use of data when it's important. But I think that that process, number one, helps students feel that they are less individual, but more of a collaborative effort towards their education, which I think is important. And it also can help sometimes, because these are smart students who bring a lot to the table. It helps them feel more empowered about the knowledge and their ability to shape change. So if we stand up in a class and talk about how history, you know, can empower you to do X, Y, and Z, we need to be able to have students in their training experience to feel that they have that sense of empowerment to be part of the discussion. Easier in some departments, obviously, than in other departments. It's kind of like if you're the difference between a Power 5 school in basketball and a mid-major. Sometimes at the mid-major level, you can do a little bit more creative things because you're not burdened by the Power 5 mentality. But try. I mean, I think that there is something to be said to engage agency from the get-go, rather than be invited to agency.
Marla, I would also add looking for programs that allow you to be flexible in how you take in the information and how you apply the information. And I'm speaking more so to programs that focus too much on theory versus practical application. There's so many times that as a practicing historian, I would say, who was also in graduate school at the same time, it was very frustrating to see so many students focus so much on the theory and things that they were reading in textbooks and journals and saying, this is the only way to do it. You can't do it any other way. You have to do it this way. And as someone who's in the field, it's like, no, it doesn't always play out that way. Just as an example, you know, I worked at a historic home, and you don't learn what to do when a raccoon chews through the wire of your historic house. Like, you have to learn how to be flexible. The books are always going to teach you that. And so it's looking at programs that teach you how to work within the spaces that you have, help you work with more hands-on training. That's going to be awesome experience that you always can't get from the book. So I would really be kind of leery of programs that just focus mainly on text and the articles, because that's not the world that you live in. It's not realistic. And you need to be able to bounce back and forth between the two. So just something to think about when looking at programs.
This is personal reflection on my own experiences as a graduate student. The demands of graduate school can feel sort of total. They can seem to take all the oxygen out of your life, especially if you put them alongside the demands of being a human. And that's a lot of demands. I think it's important to try to carve out or maintain some time and space for trying out ideas and your own presence in conversations, free of those demands, and to not sacrifice that on the altar of the deadline for graduate school or the work you have to do. And my example was, meeting every Wednesday in a pub and alternately in a coffee shop for something called Flower City Philosophy, a wide open ideas conversation with all comers in Rochester, New York. And I made that almost a religious observance. It happened every Wednesday. And some Wednesdays I'd have to go home and read and write into the night. But just to sort of breathe the space of being around people, doing grad school adjacent stuff, like talking about ideas, hearing where people are coming from, trying out my perspective in light of those other perspectives, being provoked by new people. That was so important. And in terms of my identity as a public-facing historian, that was formative. And it's so easy to have those kind of moments in your life, those kind of things you do, be the first thing out the door when graduate school gets intense, as it inevitably does. But to protect those spaces in your life is not just something that's healthy, it's something that's absolutely formative to your training as well.
You know, if I could speak to that also, this is so productive for my own thinking. So I am so grateful to you guys. I was thinking as you all were talking that that part of what's being suggested to students in the room is having the confidence to know what to ask for and to know when something's being omitted from your training. And I just want to acknowledge that's easier said than done, you know, and that because part of what we ask people to do in graduate school is to trust and learn from us. But at the same time, we all know, I mean, how many people have a story of pitching a dissertation project to a professor and the faculty member saying, oh, there's no there there, and the person goes on to write a prize-winning and important study. So you have to know when your impulse is correct and your faculty member is incorrect, and when they might have a point that you have not thought about. And this, for me, connects to Michael's point, because part of that is about building your community beyond your department. And so I just want to second what Michael is saying about, if you have a robust community of practice that isn't just about the people who are training with you or the people who are providing your training, that gives you that sense, that check and balance, like, oh yeah, I don't know, because I feel like this person I know at this other program thinks differently about this, or they're doing something different at this other school. So I just encourage anyone in graduate school and below, and we have a nice question in Feed Loop about undergraduates thinking, you know, looking ahead towards selecting a program, and, you know, just being mindful that there's a whole community that you should avail yourself of beyond that. And on the question specifically about looking for graduate programs, John Dichtel kindly reminds me in the chat that the NCPH does have a guide to public history programs. So I guess when I was doing my imagining, I was thinking the world of graduate programs, you know, and then it would be so clear, would surface how few of them are really thinking about all of these various opportunities to communicate history. But in the world of public history, NCPH has got a lot of fantastic resources on the website. So if you don't know about those yet, that's a good place to find them.
Let me also add to what Marla is saying and what the others have said, is that also to remember, for those of you who are thinking about graduate school or are currently graduate students, is you never want to have just one mentor. You want to think broadly about what your interests are. And even if you're just sticking to your own department, there's going to be people with different interests and with different abilities to broaden your horizons, whether it's in practice or whether it's in the world of ideas, or as an example of how to be a good professional person. And so you want to cultivate a range of mentors. And then if you do projects out in the community, that's another set of mentors, but it's that world of mentors that will help shape you into the professional person that you'll become, not just one person who may be your advisor or maybe the person you've worked, you know, who's assigned to you. You need to consciously think in terms of this collection of mentors to help move you with your engagement, move you towards, whatever your future you see yourself as moving toward, knowing that to some extent you're never going to be able to predict that future. And so having the ability to remain open to possibility at the same time that you see yourself moving forward becomes, I think, real important.
As we wind down, we have a few minutes left. I'd like to steer us back to our theme about public history and public intellectuals and historians who are public facing. And we have a couple of questions in the Q&A and the chat that both speak to sort of the moment we're in and the relative value of those activities. And, on the one hand, those of us in public history who see our conference flourishing and our community thriving certainly have a perception that public history has won the day. The academy itself is certainly under great threat. We read in the news all the time about departments under threat, tenure being questioned and threatened. So I wonder, and we have a question also in the chat about, the making the case for the value of public history in a department that is sort of doubling down on traditional historical practice, which we've all certainly seen as well. So I wonder if, as we wrap up the session, any thoughts about the prospects and fortunes of these areas of practice?
One attempt at pulling some of these things together responds to Casey's question and to Anne's question, and Marla, to what you said about intellectual history taking account of this broadened horizon of what is intellectual history. And I think the term public intellectual has been contested because it's seen as valuable ground. It's ground worth holding because public intellectual has been a sort of honorific or valorized role in a way that beyond the precincts of public history, public historian has not always been. And so I think there's a very strong case to be made now that public historian is the honorific, valorized role, that's the valuable terrain to situate yourself upon. And so as NCPH looks ahead to its 5th decade, if you place conversations about public intellectuals alongside conversations about public history, you see that what has been happening in public history is part of the broader history, very important, of the reconfiguration of authority in the American public sphere over a number of decades with all sorts of ramifications. From that vantage point, developments in the theory and practice of public history are enormously significant to all historians because they constitute one of, if not the richest bodies of work grappling with the always contested place of experts, professionals, and intellectuals in a democracy. Public historians, through their practice and their thinking, have been in this now for 4 decades, and they have incredibly important contributions to make to this larger conversation.
Well, Jason, you want to comment? We're almost to time. So
I just kind of assumed we were going to go around and make a last comment.
Well, I am honestly not entirely sure what happens. Like, is this like Cinderella? Do we just lose our slipper at midnight?
Okay, well, here's my last final comment, particularly for the graduate students listening. There is no one size fits all. Everything is possible. You can be a public historian if you want. You can be a public intellectual if you want. You can be an academic historian who does speaking gigs in public if you want. Those are all possibilities, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. All of them are going to be hard. All of them are going to have challenges, and you're going to have to build networks, create community in every place that you go, and also figure out how to put food on the table and pay the bills. But that's what people like us are here for. So if me or anyone else here can help you with that, reach out to us, but know that you are not shoehorned into one role or one path, especially at this stage of your career.
Great advice.
Are we done, Marla? Or
Well, I sent a note to the tech folks just to find out if it actually shuts down. In case it does, I want to thank Michael for pulling us all together. This whole session and conversation was his vision, and I know we're all grateful for the invitation to join it. So I think we could just chatting, but and I will keep the Q&A open as long. I think we'll see if we can run long if we want to. Any other final comments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to echo what the rest of you have said, that there's no one path, and don't let anyone tell you that there's one path. And you know, I feel like that was the trap that I got into in graduate school, is that I listened to people who said there was one path, and that's, again, the liberatory potential of public history, I think, coming into this organization and seeing the wide range of practices, and that it was, I felt like such a range of practices were affirmed by this group. But this, as Casey said in the comment, this is not the real, this is not representative of the academy. And so she asked this very, this question, like, how do we get academic historians to care about public history? I would say I'm going to take a line from my time in therapy and say, you can't control other people, you can only control yourself, right? You can only like work on your own stuff. And I think the fact that we're coming together and we're having these conversations, that we are going to be the example going, the most compelling example going forward by doing the work, not by arguing with other people, because we're not going to, we're not going to change, I think, those really entrenched power relationships there. So
our tech support says we do have, time for everyone to go around and offer their closing thoughts, and then they'll close us out. So Ashley, Pat, any final comments?
Well, I think one of the things that has been great about this panel is that in many respects it affirms, and then to some extent Kristen and Jason have already spoken to this, but it affirms, and Michael, it affirms the fact that we aren't tied to some limiting version of the past. It doesn't take away the hard work that still remains, but it is less gloomy than, I would say, trying to do this in the 1980s, when it was truly gloomy. Even in the department that I am in now, they can't imagine not having a public history program and training in what we call the joint program in American history and public history at the doctoral level. They now see that, even the most hidebound of them see that as one of the virtues of their department. No one would have ever said that when the program at Loyola started in the 1980s. So I think that we're in a period where we have lots of possibilities, and it's not that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's always going to be a process, but it's certainly a wider vision than we've operated under at any point in time. But the stakes are also pretty high in terms of doing it in ways that really shape both from the ground up, but also in the large picture.
I will end our discussion with just echoing what some of our fellow panelists have said, that there's so many options out there. And as someone who, again, came from a very different background into this field, I took full advantage of all of those options. And it's great to see so many emerging professionals doing the same. And I'm also glad that there are so many programs, graduate programs now, that are encouraging students to kind of create their own paths. Again, doing the best to speak up for yourselves, acknowledging what your needs are, but also acknowledging where your weaknesses are and being willing to tackle those, because staying in our comfort zones as public historians sometimes can be very easy. And pushing ourselves to kind of make sure we're well-rounded, making sure that we have all of the training that we need, and knowing that your training is never fully over. and that you have to constantly keep learning, constantly understand what the field, where the field is going, where it's been. It's just a continuous process. So this has given me so much motivation to keep pushing.
I love that as a closing note, that we are going to look forward with an understanding of the challenge, but also with optimism. So with that, we will thank all of our panelists. Again, thank Michael for pulling it together. Thank everyone who attended the session. And I hope to see you all later tonight at the plenary. So good afternoon, everybody.